Well, sometimes they should take priority, especially these days with the alert.
Yeah. Yeah, there've definitely been some that need to take priority, but
Yeah, nobody out there was evacuated or anything, right?
no, not us.
Not you guys.
I don't know that
Hopefully all those fires are.
we were just warned.
Yeah, yeah. Unfortunately, they're contained, but they're not out. So now
Right.
this weekend, we may end up with another
I know
wind
we're
event.
worried about this heat coming up.
Well, it's more the wind, I guess I'm worried about. It's supposed to be windy starting tomorrow and then hot.
That's not good.
Yes, not a good combination. All right, I see folks coming in. Normally we get somewhere on, like 25 or 30 people in this section. So we'll wait a few minutes. But what I thought I'd start with was going to be the blood pressure handout. So if you want to pull that out, I'm going to share that screen, which I can't write on, but I can share. So let me get mine out for that matter. Yeah. We will start about 11:15 since I was the one who went over. Get rid of this thing. Yeah, we're getting there. Yeah. Oh. So for those of you who came in since I said it a minute ago, we're starting at 11:15 and we're going to start with the blood pressure handout. So if you haven't gotten that out, then you can probably help you to get it out. Did you eat your breakfast? Huh? Okay, folks. So what I'll do is share the screen of the blood pressure handout first. And I think the beginning part is pretty easy. So maybe you guys can yell at me if there's something that you need in this first part, but this is really reiterating information in the lab manual, and then what stenosis and competence means, which is also in the lab manual, but I also gave it certain sounds so that when I give you a murmur like this, you'd be able to analyze it. So anyone need anything in A, B, or C? At least the first part of C? Okay. All right, so let's do a few of these murmurs. Maybe I'll put
A and
that up
B,
too. I'm sorry, was that you, Louis?
Can you go over A and B, please?
You do want to go over A and B? Okay. All right. Let me also put my chat up so that if some people want to answer these things, they can do it in chat instead of orally. The heart sounds love and to the phase of the cardiac cycle in which they occur. When you're hearing love, what are you hearing? I could probably type it here. What does that sound of? Anybody type? You can chat or you can say it. Yes, AV close. And what phase did they close in? Okay, I'm getting these in chat, so I'm putting them in. So that's correct. And then these are clearly the semilunar closing. And what phase of the cardiac cycle is that happening in? Or what does it define? The start of. Remember, as soon as you see oops, I didn't spell that right, did I? Oh, volumetric, relax. As soon as you see isovolumetric, then you know all four are closed. That doesn't mean clearly during the filling phase, these guys are open, but that guy is closed. So you should know that as well. But the closure of a valve usually dictates the beginning of one of those isovolumetric phases. Okay, so this is right off of the map of the chest wall. And I said the easiest way in my mind to do this is to realize you're going along the sternum. Your heart's right under your sternum, nicely protected by your sternum. So if you are dealing with the semilunars like this one, then you're going to be in the second intercostal space. And which side, left or right? Anybody can put it in. Yes, it's on the right side, which doesn't seem to make sense in some ways because, of course, it's from the left ventricle, but that's just the tilting of the heart. Whereas over here, again, it's second intercostal, just to make it easier to remember, but it's on the left side. If you're dealing with the AV, then you're always dealing with the fifth intercostal space. And this time it does match what you'd expect with this one being on the right and this being the fifth and this being intercostal and that being on the left. Okay, reasons for abnormal sounds. So what is the underlying problem someone's having if there's stenosis of a valve? Anyone just type in, it's not open enough. Okay, not open enough. So blood is trying to go through a narrowed opening. And that's usually, well, that's always what stenosis means. There is some sort of narrowing of the opening. Versus incompetence, that means leakage, right? When it's closed, so this is a problem when it's open. So we'll put that here too. Problem when the valve is open. So if the valve's not open, then stenosis isn't any issue. This leakage is when valve is closed. So when you go to do these analysis, then you have to ask yourself, what valve is open or what valve is closed according to the sound. So if I'm hearing swish, then you want to say, well, what valve should be closed before I hear the lup and dup? And so what type of valve, semilunar or AV, is a problem with this murmur? Yeah, semilunar. And semilunar is incompetent. If you're now hearing lub screech dub, then what do you have? You have a stenotic valve, but which type? Yeah, so this is stenosis of a semilunar. They're both semilunar in this case, but clearly I could do an AV and be different. So play around, just make these in different orders and then try and analyze what it is. Now this is asking where specifically you find this valve. So if we're at the second intercostal space on the left side and you're hearing that it's a semilunar valve, well, you put together what you wrote up here. Who's at the second intercostal space? It's the aortic, right? We know it's a semilunar. We analyzed up here. So this would be the aortic semilunar, and it would be incompetent. Okay, now I changed this one. So if we're having a swish sound here, then we know that somebody who's closed, which clearly ought to be an AV valve because that preceded it. These guys closed. They're leaky, and now it's at the fifth intercostal, which will also tell you it's an AV valve problem, but it's on the right side. So which one? It's on the right side, so it's the tricuspid, right?
Professor?
Yeah.
Wouldn't number 1 for 3 be the pulmonary because it's at the left second intercostal?
Oh, I'm sorry. You're right. I said it wrong. So I'm reading over there and then I went along. Yeah, it's the pulmonary. Sorry. Yes, these two are switched. They're left and the right. I apologize for that. Okay, so what I'm asking you to do here is kind of, since you can't do the lab, then I would like you to know how it should be done. And unfortunately, I think that even though the lab manual explains it, I think that Kevin didn't explain it very well. And in fact, I'm not even sure he did it as it should be done because he was doing it by himself. And it's almost impossible. And the other thing that it suggests that he didn't do it like it's supposed to be done is he has exactly the same apical heart rate of 60 beats per minute. So his data was 60, 60, 60 for his getting his heart rate from his chest wall. And that seems unlikely if you're actually, doing 15 seconds that you'd get exactly the same count. So my guess is he did one and then he did the other. But what's critical in doing an apical radial pulse is that you do them simultaneously. Listen to apical and radial. So for the exact same 15-second block or 30-second block, whatever you choose, you're counting how many beats. If you don't do the exact same time, then you don't know whether you've actually, you're dealing with a short period of time and you're dealing with a fairly rapid event, so you could be off. And because of that, when you guys would do this in lab, it would take two. The person who is being tested usually listens to their own heart on their chest wall with a stethoscope while the other person takes their pulse. And we're not very exact, so we go 1, 2, 3, go, and then you start counting. And often they don't come up with the perfect one that Kevin came up with. But I think the idea of it being done simultaneously is important. And since I'm not sure he did that, when he did it, then he got an apical radial ratio of exactly 1 with his data. So that actually rarely happens. Usually you see some slight difference, a little above or a little below 1. But if it's a substantial difference where you have fewer radial than you have apical and therefore less than 1, then you have a condition known as a pulse deficit. So what were some reasons that the lab manual gave for a pulse deficit? Anyone can type them in if they want or say them.
Weakened heart.
Yes, weak contractions of the heart. So that could be happening chronically, where your cardiac output is dropped because maybe you have heart disease and your heart is failing, it's not able to contract. It could happen because you have low blood volume or low venous return. So, so those would be true for kind of chronic conditions, and that would be where you'd be using the pulse deficit to see that. What other things does it mention? This is right in the lab manual.
Abnormal heart rhythms. I think people.
Yes, abnormal rhythm. So once again, with an abnormal rhythm, let's say the heart goes really, really fast for a while. During that really, really fast period, then it's not able to get enough venous return. It beats weakly. So that it's not like 1 and 2 are unrelated. And then maybe it goes slow. So your body is overall maybe being served, but you have these rapid heartbeat where you're not getting good venous return. You're getting a weak contraction during those, and apical radial pulse would be affected. Another one, and they didn't actually name this, but you should be able to envision it, is afibrillation. If you have atrial fibrillation, then you're not able to fulfill an end diastolic volume, which is normal, right? You're going to be having low end diastolic volume, low preload, and therefore less of a pulse because you're not going to be pushing as hard. The heart's not contracting as hard. Systolic pressure is going to drop. And if this happens and diastolic pressure is normal, what it normally was before the atrial fibrillation, then you'll have a small pulse pressure. So there's a bunch of reasons that both I have or the book has. And they're good review too for the, not just the lab test, but for the exam. So now these sounds of Korthoff, however you pronounce that, those sounds, you should understand what is going on. And I explain it here. Again, the videos that I referred to last time and are now in the latest version of the study guide are worth looking at because they'll explain that again. And this is where, again, I think this is because he was doing this to himself. But it points out some interesting things. When he takes his blood pressure, he gets a very high number and a high heart diastolic pressure for his first value. And then he drops down to more normal systolic and diastolic pressure. So sometimes, and I think I mentioned this before, sometimes when you go to do this, your sympathetic nervous system gets kicked in, even if a doctor is doing it for you. Oh, Alex gave me something we could put up here too. We could put blood loss on decreasing venous return. So you can see that blood pressure is a moment by moment, and it's certainly affected by your sympathetic activation. So whenever you get excited or worried or embarrassed or whatever, and it's probably a little worrisome to cut off blood flow to your own arm, which is probably what he was doing. So he had initial high systolic and high diastolic pressure because he activated his sympathetic nervous system. But once he averaged it out, it came pretty good. He averaged those 3, which is one reason you would do this even in the lab. You might be worried about that crazy lab partner of yours cutting off blood to your arm and end up with some high pressures here as well. So hopefully you could calculate. Can somebody give me what value you got in here? Not for the pulse pressure. I'm getting good ones now, and then I'm getting lots of other things. Okay, so what we're looking is pulse. I can't point at this and have you see it. Pulse pressure. So what we want to do is take his average diastolic and subtract that from the systolic. So I got 36.4 when I did that, because I got an average systolic pressure of 113.7 and a diastolic of 77.3. So those were within a normal value, right? Because normal, we said, was 40. I don't give you normal ranges of blood pressure, but you probably should know that if it's over 100, we'll use the 140 for systolic, then you have hypertension. And if it's over 90 for diastolic, then you have hypertension. But we didn't really talk about low end of the blood pressure. We will come to something important down here in a minute, but we didn't talk about the low end. Okay, so what about mean arterial pressure? Anybody get a value for that here? 82, okay. Well, there may be some math challenges, but people are getting, some people got what I got, which is 89.4. So it might be worth proving to yourself that if you take his systolic pressure and, his diastolic pressure and then his pulse pressure divided by 3, you will get exactly the same thing as if you take 1/3 his systolic plus 2/3 his diastolic, that those numbers should come out. And hopefully this math issues would, if this arises during the lab test, which is where you'd have to do something like these calculations, then I highly recommend you show your work in your math calculations. And you cannot use a calculator. I will use numbers that you better be able to do in your head, because this isn't elementary school. So they're not going to be something like divide 113.7 by 3. They're going to be something easier to divide than that. So you won't be able to use a calculator, and therefore what you should do is show me your work on the piece of paper, because I do give partial credit if it's just a simple math problem. However, if you're going to take the TEAS test, you better get your math skills down. So this one is something that I realized this morning when I went to fill this out, that I really should have added this phrase to it, because otherwise you won't really be able to explain it. So you'll see a little difference in your handout in this one. The 60 millimeters of mercury is what would be normally 93. So under the case when you have mean arterial pressure in the large arteries of 93. Now, how did I get 93? That's the 120/80 blood pressure, normal blood pressure, where we calculated using those two numbers, mean arterial pressure. So 93, by the time you get to the capillaries, right, goes down to 30, 35. And this is what SA4, you've got to know all these numbers. So it's approximately, and I know they have an approximate thing on here. I lost it. I don't use it very much, so I'll just write approximate. It's taking more time doing that. Approximately 1/3, right? It's dropped by about 1/3 of its original value. So if we now take 60, a mean arterial pressure of 60, and we make that drop by 1/3, it's going to be 20. Does that make sense? Any questions in the chat or orally? Okay, now we're at the arterial end of the capillary. And at that arterial end, the hydrostatic pressure is now 20. The osmotic pressure is 25. So you're going to have, that's going to lead to, rather than an outward flow, an inward flow of 5 millimeters of mercury, right? So on the arterial end, where stuff ought to be coming out, stuff is going into the blood vessel. And then when it goes to the other side, now normally it goes from 35 to 17, so it's approximately halving. So now we're going to be on the venous side 10, and the osmotic pressure is still 25. So that's going to lead to, oops, that's the wrong way. That's going to lead to a minus 10. You're going to keep losing fluid from your tissues into your blood without ever serving those tissues with, nothing's coming out of your blood. So not only are you dehydrating the tissues, but you're not providing them with nutrients and probably, well, oxygen may be able to get in there and CO2 because they can go through membranes through simple diffusion. But any of it that's being carried in the plasma, which we'll later learn CO2 is largely carried in the plasma, that's not going to be going in very, well, that is going to be going in, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's going to be going in, but you're not going to do good exchange. This person is circling the drain. They're going to die if they don't get a better mean arterial pressure. So that's a kind of new explanation. Can you recreate it, or or any questions about that? Okay, hopefully just using the numbers, that makes sense. You could even, just challenge yourself, see how high, what can I, add to this enough so I can get at least some perfusion of the tissue, not just perfusion, but capillary exchange occur. Okay, so once again, I realize this, but I know Kevin's doing the best he can when he's doing this on his own. Typically, this works better when we're in person, but even then, person to person can react differently with their sympathetic nervous response, and that's going to affect this. So if you look at the numbers that he had with these postural changes, then think theoretically about what should happen when your arm goes from normal to being above your head. So he holds it up there for 2 minutes. And in order to service this arm with more blood, then his sympathetic nervous system is going to have to help him beat harder. Because initially you might get greater venous return that helped him, right? As soon as your arm goes up, the blood's going to flow out of your arm back towards your heart. But he's holding it up for 2 minutes before he does his postural change. And that means that you're going to have to beat harder and raise your blood pressure. Now, the problem is in his numbers, which doesn't typically happen in person, is he starts with a high blood pressure. Remember his, not his systolic, but his high heart rate. He had a 92 in here, I think, and 93. So his systolic, if anything, was a little bit low. I'm not sure why compared to what he had before. But then his heart rate is high. So some of these numbers that he gave you don't really help you, and then we're using these to compare to the rest. So I'm not sure why he ended up with such a low systolic but a high heart rate, but that's what he showed. Now, if you go back and you look at what he had when he was seated, his systolic pressure, do I remember what it was?
Professor?
Yeah.
I think you might have labeled that the seated with an arm raised one level up for the 93.
Oh, you're right. I did. Yes, it was 75 here, right? And 78. I was on the previous page. Is that what he had? 75 and...
On my end, I had 98 millimeters of mercury, and on the heart rate, I had 75.
Oh, sorry. I switched them. Okay. Thank you for correcting me. Still, that's a low systolic, right? But a normal, more or less normal for him, high though. heart rate. Because before, when he did it, when he started this whole thing, his heart rate was 60. So now his heart rate's a little high and his systolic pressure is low, relatively low. And maybe does have relatively low blood pressure, but when he did it up here, it varied from 101 to 130. So this doesn't totally make a lot of sense. He's got a high heart rate, which would suggest sympathetic activation, but a lower systolic when he's just sitting there. And then he goes, sorry, and this is where I put these numbers because I turned the page. So then he went 93 here, which is a drop in his systolic pressure. And it should, if anything, go up. And his heart rate went up, right? 92. So I understand best what should happen when your arms above fully flexed. Initially, you might see a rise in systolic because you get a sudden increase in venous return. But if you're leaving it up there for a while, you can even feel your arm could go numb if you leave it up there long enough because you're not getting enough blood supply to the nerves going up to your arm. And therefore, your heart, the only way it can help service it is more of your body is above gravity. It's going to have to raise your your sympathetic response, and therefore your heart rate will go up, but your systolic pressure ought to go up as well. All right, so I wasn't there. I didn't see what happened. So I guess what we should do when I give him this next time is make him do a resting one again before he's seated. Now, what we do in person is we have a different person do this and then does this. So that can help because if he starts with this high heart rate and then he goes and does this, you may not see it as much of a change. So by having two different people do this, that helps. Plus, he should be recording his seated one again. But if we go back to his old seated one, then he had a blood pressure here, a systolic pressure of something like, 114, right? 113 was his average, and a heart rate of like 77, 78. I guess it's more like 77. And then he goes and does this immediately standing up. Well, so theoretically, what ought to happen is if he's been seated for a while, he's got this resting blood pressure of 114 and heart rate of 77. When he stands up, it becomes harder for venous return in all of his lower body to return blood. So immediately on standing, you should see a drop in systolic. And you do see a number where you see a drop in his systolic pressure if you use his old numbers. He has already, though, apparently initiated his sympathetic. Now, you see it's less than that, 92. So maybe, he's done this exercise and that right in a row. But nervous system is pretty fast too. So it might have started the heart rate up before it's gotten greater contractility. Or this might have even dropped lower than 105 from 114 and it's on the way up. So what you should expect here is a lower venous return and a drop in systolic pressure. This might be up a bit because your sympathetic response is pretty quick. So I'd say this fits about what we'd see in person. So then he stands for a while. Now, why we wanted him to stand for a while is we wanted his heart to be compensating for this new, not just his heart compensating, but his blood vessels compensating. And he's just standing there, and you're going to hopefully return your systolic pressure by diverting blood back from other areas in your body, your digestive tract, your skin and such. You should see a return of systolic pressure, a drop down, which he did. It doesn't, it's not his average, is actually a little below his average from before, but it's somewhere around this resting position. And then once again, you see a further drop of his heart rate because now you're standing for a while and your venous return is being regulated by diverting blood back. So you're getting a more normal venous return. and everything should return to closer to a resting level. So I hope this is the version I gave you, but I did a lot of talking here, so you can try to fill those out as you best you can. And then you're turning this in by 5 this afternoon. So are there any questions on that before we leave this?
So for number 2, immediately after standing, you're saying we should talk about how the systolic drops immediately after standing?
Now you could say theoretically it should, his systolic should drop because of lower venous return, and his heart rate might go up quickly because your sympathetic can act pretty quickly on your autorhythmic, and they're trying to act on your contractile, but end diastolic volume is low, preload is low, and your main determinant of what your cardiac output and systolic pressure would be venous return, which should have dropped.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Okay. All right. So I'm going to stop sharing this. I'm going to hope that my iPad will behave itself, and we can do whatever you'd like on the review. This is up to you. We do have the sample test too. We could do that. I could share that if you want. Or you could ask questions, and it looks like Kaylin has a question. So go ahead and unmic yourself. Well, here she typed it. Systolic pressure for continued standing again. Okay. So once you continue standing, then you're going to be using all your other compensatory mechanisms besides going right to the heart and telling the heart, there's too low venous pressure here. You're going to start having your sympathetic cause vasoconstriction in some areas, like the skin and your digestive tract, so that venous return will go back up, and it's going to let your heart work less hard to bring your systolic back up to normal. So what in theory should happen is, if you're a young person, it's harder to see this, but what should happen is that when you stand for a while, your resting heart rate and blood pressure ought to be not that dissimilar, maybe a little higher, but not that dissimilar from when you're seated. Does that answer? You good, Kaylin? Okay. All right. So any suggestions? You can put them in. Why don't everybody put whatever they would like to do for the review for the exam into the chat, and then I'll just do whatever you guys want to do.
Professor?
Mm-hmm.
For the blood pressure worksheet, so do you want us to just keep like what you think would theoretically happen if it doesn't correlate with Kevin?
No, put his numbers, and then and when you do your explanation, say this is what I should see.
Okay.
Okay, I've only gotten one request so far. Anyone else, or you guys all? And that request was to do the sample exam. So I know with 4 days of studying, many times people leave this to closer to the weekend or whatever, and so you may not have questions because you haven't thought about this enough. So I do have an office hour on Tuesday at 8 a.m. But I will be around on Monday, and so if you need to talk to me, just email me, and we can talk and have a spontaneous office hour. But it's so far looking like the only votes coming in are for the sample exam, and then I got a vague request about just what are the most important points. Well, all of that is, I can't say all of it's the most important points, but I based the essay questions and the lecture questions on what I think is most important. And you can't not learn this material because you're going to need it for the rest of the semester. So it may seem like a big chunk to take in, but it's so critical for what we need as we go forward into the respiratory system, the urinary system, acid-base balance, and even the digestive system. So, so this is important part of the class. Well, all of it's important, but this is an important part because it has consequences later. So really try and get this solid. All right, so I know that's not a very reassuring answer to what's the most important. I am going to go find the sample exams, which I believe I left on the desktop, or did I put them over here? Guess I should have had that one available. We'll just do it from Canvas because it's in there. Okay. Got a bazillion announcements now. Did I put the sample exam? Yeah, I did. Embedded it in here. Okay. I didn't put a date on this, and so I'm not sure how old this sample exam is. It is an old exam that I gave. Let's see what else came in while I was looking for that. So I'm sure the last few questions on the blood pressure. All right. Well, if I've gone over the blood pressure handout, so I do have an office hour for anyone who's still struggling with those last three questions or any other part. So if you can just meet me at that office hour. I do have to leave my office hour today early because I have an appointment, but I have 20 minutes there. And also, I'm going to do this again because there are people who can't schedule this lab. So I always have a handful of people show up in the second lab. I'll go over the handout again if you want to hear it again. Yeah. So someone else said the exam question derived from the essays. Yeah, 90% from the essays and the lecture questions. Lecture questions are, I wrote the essays and then I wrote lecture questions based on the essay. So it's all part of that. All right, so let me share this exam screen. And let's make this bigger, or at least where I can see the whole thing. So this will not be what you have. You're not going to be able to eliminate questions. All questions are going to have to be answered. Canvas just does not deal well with that, and it makes my life crazy and probably your life crazy. So one thing to be aware of with Canvas, and this happened, hopefully it won't happen as much this semester, but last semester, Dr. Sundar and I worked very close together, and he would proofread my exams, and he's just overwhelmed this semester. He's got a lot more students. He's not doing that. So please, if you see a problem with a test question, please just text me, go into chat, not text me, but go into chat and tell me there's a problem. If you need to interrupt me about something, interrupt me. But also, once it's graded, it's automatically graded by Canvas, but I always go back and I look at each person's Canvas quiz. So that may not be your final grade in Canvas. So don't panic if you go, oh, that should have been graded right. Sometimes later I have to go back and because of the way Canvas is interpreted. And that's why you're seeing not so many different formats of questions, because I just got burned last semester by trying out some of the formats in Canvas, like fill in the blank, when it wouldn't accept a capitalized word that was identical to the answer. So it has these, it's not a very flexible system. So unfortunately, okay, so let's take a look at these multiple choice, and let me see what's in chat just to make sure haven't gotten something new in chat that, yeah, no, nothing new in chat. Okay. So, contractile cardiac fibers between which structures are not directly connected. A key word in this question is directly, meaning if I am a cardiac contractile, I'm another cardiac contractile, I form an intercalated disc between some, that's a direct contact. If I have to have an interceding autorhythmic fiber, it's not a direct contact. So left and right ventricles, the left and right ventricles are entirely interconnected by intercalated discs, and we know that because if there's a bundle branch problem, one bundle branch fails, you still get contraction of both ventricles. It takes longer to happen because you're having to conduct it from contractile to contractile for part of the heart. You've lost the bundle branch that would normally make that happen. So that's not the right answer, because this you're looking for not directly connected. The left atrium and left ventricle, autorhythmic, are the only thing that connect those two to each other, because the atrial are connected to the two sides, the right and left atria, the right and left ventricle, but not the atrium to the ventricle. They have to have autorhythmic, particularly the AV node and the bundles of His to get the atrial signal to the ventricle. So septum and ventricles, well, the septum is actually part of the ventricle, so that one doesn't make any sense. And the two atria are all connected. So the answer is B. We good on this? I'm going through the wrong answers because, not only because you can see the thinking, since some of you don't know me, but also because the wrong answers sometimes cover material. It's a good way to review it. So this is just an increase, decrease. Now, one thing this semester overall you may find, and I may fall back on using more of these because there shouldn't be too many ways people mess up, although Canvas wouldn't accept increasing if I put increase, but I have an option of putting every possible right answer. So if I could take those two words and make every possible right answer as a right answer, capitalize all of them, capitalize the first letter, have an S, don't have an S, and have all that be considered right. I may fall back because it's really a good exercise this semester to do these increase, decrease, and I often fall back in person on doing this in tests. So pacemaker potential, what happens to sodium permeability during that rising phase of the pacemaker potential? Is it increasing or decreasing? Well, it's increasing because that's what makes it depolarize. What makes them open and more of these funny channels open is the decreasing potassium permeability. And you know that because potassium is getting closer and closer to, it's hyperpolarizing, but it's getting closer and closer to its equilibrium potential. Now, I've changed since I've written this. I probably wouldn't make a just decrease, increase here. I'd want you to, really understand. But this is literally the way the book explains it. So I think, you'd be able to answer it even if I did. All right, the least permeable type of capillary, this is just tell me which is the least permeable, coronary, continuous, fenestrated, or sinusoidal. And, hopefully it's obvious to you that this is continuous. Now, one might argue coronary are a type of continuous, and so I probably would have to accept both A and B, but this is the broader category, so it's really the better answer. If I wanted to, I could throw in here, instead of coronary, I could put cerebral capillaries, and then that would be the actual answer. Continuous. Cerebral are a type of continuous, but remember, these continuous do have paracellular route unless they're cerebral capillaries, or the ovarian or testicular barriers also have no paracellular. So that would be tricky, but I could, in theory, ask it that way. Just stop me or throw something in chat if there's something I see, great. Some people are even answering as, here's a concept someone wants me to do, and I think we'll touch on it. So when we get to it, then I will answer that concept. Okay. Blood pressure decreases most dramatically. Now, what I was looking was arterials, although arterials, it goes from something like 80 to 35. In the capillaries, it goes from 35 to 17. So, some people would argue this one. It's maybe not the best, but the curve is certainly the steepest when you're going from the arteries to through the arterioles. Okay, this is just, again, an increase-decrease. According to the second formula for determining cardiac output, when peripheral resistance decreases, blood pressure must increase, right? Peripheral resistance is in the denominator, and if you make that number larger and you're trying to keep what it equals to cardiac output the same value, then you have to increase blood pressure. Okay. So someone just threw up decrease. So the answer, though, is increase. So if that is not something you understand, then you better type it in or ask me more here.
I think it decreased.
Okay, so let me get my iPad and try and share that so I can write on it, since I can't write on this.
How does it increase?
Share. Oops, I did the wrong thing. Sorry. I got to click that and then that. And then I have to go over here. Okay. The formula is cardiac output equals delta P, right, over R. And what that says, if I remember the question right, and somebody correct me if I didn't, is you increase this value, right? And what it says is you want to keep this the same. So this has to stay the same. The only way I can make that stay the same is if I increase this. And the only way to increase that is to increase my systolic. The heart has to beat harder. Have I got that, June? You can unmic yourself if you want, because I'm sure you're not the only one with this question.
Oh, maybe I didn't understand the problem.
Professor, it says that the question in the TPR is decreasing.
It says the what is decreasing?
The resistance is decreasing.
Oh, did I go the other way?
Yes, yeah, you did.
I misread it. So the concept's the same. I'm sorry, June. You are right. I was wrong. I gotta slow down here. Okay, we'll stop sharing this and we'll go back to sharing and I'll try and read the questions better. Sure, oops, I'm doing the wrong thing again. Share again. Over here. I'm sure you guys have kicked yourself after making that same mistake. Oh yeah, it does say decrease, and I read in my brain increase. Okay. All right, so found in reticulocytes, but not in RBCs. So this one, I think, has got problematic wording. It does have spectrin, but the spectrin is not arranged into, a structure that will make the RBC like a mature RBC. So I was looking for spectrin, but neither of them have nuclei. Both of them have hemoglobin. Both have some ribosomes, and neither of them have mitochondria. So spectrin is your best answer, even though I probably should word it as spectrin fibers or mature spectrin or something like that. Because if there are no nuclei and they have very few ribosomes, they're unlikely to be synthesizing spectrum as a reticulocyte. So they just don't have it arranged properly yet. Excessive levels of erythropoietin, you see again an increase, decrease. What would that cause the blood pressure to do? Increase or decrease? So let me get my chat open again so I can see if
Increase.
anybody is catching me. What was number 2? Okay, somebody answered her. Okay. Yep, everybody's saying it's going to increase, and that's because viscosity is going to go up. And when viscosity goes up, resistance goes up, and it is going to increase. Let me see if I can find a place to put the chat that I can still see it. Okay, this is review from 103. No, it's not necessarily. I think, I can't remember if I covered this in 103A, but you definitely need to know this all semester. And if I skipped it, then I won't test you on it. I don't think it's in the test. But at the same time, you really need to know these enzymes. The enzyme renin, which is released by the granular cells, acts on angiotensin which is the only place that's answered. So hopefully you'd be able to answer even if this was on your test. C, to form angiotensin 1, and then another enzyme called ACE, which is angiotensin converting enzyme. That's what that stands for. Acts on angiotensin 1 to form the most active form, which is angiotensin 2. So if I didn't cover ACE in this set of lectures or didn't mention it, then don't worry, I don't think it's on the test at all. I wrote the test a while ago now, but you definitely need it for this semester because we're going to keep running back to that. Which acts as a negative feedback loop during blood clotting? Since we just did this, maybe you guys could give me an answer. Is it serotonin, prothrombin, platelet adhesion and activation, or fibrinogen, or fibrin? D, fibrin, right. So this absorbs the thrombin, binds it up so it can't make any more fibrin from fibrinogen. Okay. Which of the following is formed by both the extrinsic and intrinsic pathways? Well, serotonin, that's not it because clearly that is released by the platelets. Albumin, well, that's made by the liver and it's already there, so we're not worrying about that. So we're down to prothrombin activator, or fibrinogen. Which one of those 3? Prothrombin activator, right? Got a couple of the right answers here. So fibrinogen's made by the liver. It's already there. It's not made during the actual pathways. Prothrombin is made by the liver. So actually, this one are all made by the liver, and as well as the clotting factors. So this one is, if the person didn't have a functioning liver, what could be a symptom? Would edema be a symptom? Maybe just say yes or no. Yes, I'm getting lots of, well, I got some no's. So if you had a non-functioning liver and you made too little albumin, then your osmotic pressure would drop and greater amount of fluid would come out because your hydrostatic pressure would be able to push against less of an osmotic pressure. And then it would be harder to pull things back in on the venous side because it's the osmotic pressure that's pulling stuff back in. So you would definitely have edema. Would your blood clotting be slow? Hopefully, from what I just said before, yes. Would you have anemia potentially? Yeah, because the liver has the iron storage and also makes transferrin to move that iron to the bone marrow. So even if its role in EPO is minimal, it still isn't providing the raw materials for which is iron. And it also is involved in the recycling, so maybe even amino acids would not be being. A jaundice, yes, because the liver takes that bilirubin and makes it into bile. So you could have jaundice. So yes, yes, and yes, everything is true. Platelets release all of the following except, and this one there's a little bit of a problem here, but which one is the best answer? Anyone? E. Yeah, E is clearly, tissue factor is clearly not. It doesn't actually release platelet factor 3. It's part of it, makes it and puts it in its membrane. Now, I've done this one as a sample test for a while, so I know people struggle a bit with this. I wonder if there's a way. I haven't transferred it to my iPad, so I can't really write on this. So what I suggest is make sure that you have your that picture open while you're trying this out, and that will help reinforce it. And it's not entirely the way that it's not the most ideal sometimes in the way that it's worded, but let's try and go through this. So this is the cardiac cycle one, right? So I'm asking here about, is atrial pressure rising or falling between the P wave and the QRS wave? Well, hopefully you know that the P wave is atrial depolarization, so that we're in the second half of ventricular filling, and we haven't started the Q wave yet. I probably should have just said between P and Q, because once we add RS, it becomes a little bit complicated. But here the P wave and the Q wave, you would definitely have it increasing because you would be contracting the atria at that point. During the QRS, you are repolarizing, so therefore pressure ought to be low at the end of the QRS wave. And then I just filled in one for you. And it's increasing during the T wave because your AV valves are closed and through that isovolumetric relaxation phase, and therefore, or even before it, it's therefore they're closed before that. Therefore, blood is filling it up. It's not contracting. It's just blood is filling the atria and the auricles. But I gave that one to you. Okay, ventricular volume. And this is where between the P, again, it should really be P and Q wave, you should really see large ventricular volume. And it's increasing because that volume's increasing because blood is arriving. I hope that's obvious, that the volume is increasing because blood is being pushed in by contraction of the atria. By the end of the QRS wave, then its volume ought to be decreasing because it's contracting during that phase. And then its volume goes back to increasing because it's relaxing throughout the T wave as it repolarizes. Okay, valve position. Well, you know you're in ventricular filling phase here. So this guy ought to be open and this guy is closed. Now it's closed because at that point the ventricles are relaxed. Pressure is low in the ventricle and blood is falling backwards in the large vessels towards the ventricle. At the end of the QRS, this guy's got to be closed because it closes early in contraction of the ventricle, and we're at the end of that. And then the semilunars will be opening at, I'd have to look at the chart exactly, but they're going to be opening at the shortly after the QRS is done, or shortly before the QRS is done, I think. And then at the end of the T wave is when the semilunar semilunar closes because of the blood falling back. So double check me by having, I don't have the table in front of me, with exactly what falls under each row, but that was the logic that I would follow as you fill that out. So this could be a short answer type thing. So be careful with this. It's also an increase decrease. So this may be a way I could ask increase decrease is by just making them short answers and then telling you to give me an explanation. So I actually really liked this one. A lot of students didn't like it, but this is saying, no, just tell me not why it's good or what happens, what are the consequences. I want a mechanism. So when I say how, I want you to tell me what is the underlying mechanism by which this acts. So this says state whether it increases or decreases blood pressure and then how. So if you pick, let's say we act to increase the blood pressure here, then the mechanism is that these guys, when the pressure goes up, they lower their action potential rate, and that activates the pressure has gone up, and wait, maybe I'm wording this wrong, because it says act to increase blood pressure. That means the pressure is already low. So that means that they are relaxed, so there's fewer action potentials, but more action potentials. They're not as stretched as they want, so they're fewer. I'm sorry, I'm flailing around here. Sorry. Let's go start over again. If they're acting to increase the blood pressure, that means the blood pressure should be lower than they're used to. That means that they're kind of floppy. They're not sending as many action potentials to the cardiovascular center. What that does is activate the sympathetic and inactivate the parasympathetic. So if you get the heart of that and you go the right direction, unlike me, then you should be able to get full credit. These are only 2 points, so if you don't give me every detail, but you at least tell me that it's activating sympathetic, maybe you don't say it deactivates the parasympathetic, you would get full credit. Are we all right on this? Any questions on this one now that I screwed it up? Okay, hopefully you got it down better than I do there. All right, epinephrine acts to, and this is all about blood pressure, not heart rate. So acts to bind to beta receptors. You could choose, there's lots of answers you could choose here. Binds to beta 1 receptors on cardiac contractile and makes more calcium enter and then contract stronger. You could say that. You could say it binds to alpha 1 receptors in the skin and the viscera, increases venous return, and increases blood pressure. There's choices, and all those choices are correct choices. ADH acts to, again, bunch of choices here. ADH acts to increase water retention from the urine and therefore increase blood volume and increases blood pressure. You could pick ADH acts to vasoconstrict because it's vasopressin as well, and that increases venous return and increases blood pressure. So there you go. You could say much the same about angiotensin 2. It's a vasoconstrictor. Or you could say it causes aldosterone to be released. So sodium is coming out of the urine and water's following sodium, therefore blood volume goes up. We okay with this? I think you've got this down. Here's aldosterone again, where you'd have to say sodium coming in and increasing blood volume. ANP does the opposite. So it suppresses aldosterone. It's a vasodilator, and it lowers blood pressure. We all right? Okay, I went through that pretty quick. If there are any questions, I'll give you a second to ask those. Let's see what time it is. Okay. Okay, it looks like you feel like you're good, or else it's all spinning around in your eyeballs or rotating in your head, and you need to work on it. Okay, so these are just fill in the blank. Always if I do ever, which I may stay away from like the plague, I don't know, fill in the blanks with Canvas tests, then always proofread them afterwards. Make sure you read it so that it makes sense. And I wouldn't do it immediately. I would do all of them and then go back and proofread them, because just like I read into that multiple choice an increase where there was a decrease, you want to make sure that what you write makes sense in the sentence. AV valves close when the pressure in the blank exceeds the pressure in the blank. And hopefully you could see this would be the pressure in the ventricle is exceeding the pressure in the atria. So you're pushing back on the valve. It's trying to bow in, but the chordae tendineae are keeping it from inverting. And Now, this is a combination, fill in the blank and circle one. So this one may be voltage-gated calcium channels in contractile. Are they faster or are they slower than the voltage-gated channels in the autorhythmic? And these, of course, are the slow ones, and these are the fast voltage-gated. And the duration of the action potential are faster than those, slower than those, and prolong. I'm looking for prolong the duration of the action potential. So if you put slower, that would probably fly, even though it's not very readable that way. But I was looking for how they make that long plateau in the action potential. Okay, we have another increase, decrease, a sudden increase in preload. I hope you know by now because you went to bed every night saying preload and woke up in the morning saying preload would increase cardiac output. And it would do it by decreasing end systolic volume and increasing stroke volume. So this goes back to essay 3, where we're just talking about what are these variables and their relationships. So lots of things you can do in here. How do you increase venous return? Well, you could increase blood volume. You could increase thoracic pump. You could increase the muscular pump. You could vasoconstrict. So lots and lots of answers for that one. That's why handwritten test is better than a Canvas test. Autorhythmic cardiac lack. This is essay 1. You could put a bazillion things in here. Sarcomeres, lack, troponin, lack, myosin, a lot, dyads, lots of things you could put in here, T-tubules. And so there's 2 things you're meant to choose. So lots of answers. Okay. During the early part of ventricular filling, the AV valves, I hope you know, are open because if you can't fill the ventricle unless they are. And the semilunar are closed because of that blood falling back. So what I mean by pathology is something that could cause there to be, cause you to be unhealthy is maybe the way. Now, if you put taller here, I would accept it, even though it's not a pathology really to be tall. But you're increasing peripheral resistance, so you have 3 things, diameter, but if you put diameter, then I would probably not accept that unless you said arteriosclerosis. That would affect diameter, affect laminar flow. Probably the easiest thing to put in here is obesity and say dehydration, high viscosity blood, something like that. Blood doping, you could put for that. But there are more than one answer. You have to explain more if you put diameter. If you just wrote diameter, because large diameter, small diameter, or what's making the diameter change? Okay, 2 local signals that cause arterial dilation. This is right out of that. And I would accept, besides nitric oxide and prostacycline, I would accept like high potassium or low oxygen. I would accept the triggers that are sent. But what wouldn't work would be norepinephrine or angiotensin II, because those are not local signals. Those are extrinsic signals. Okay, negative feedback regulation of erythropoiesis stimulates RBC production when the kidney releases it due to a drop in. And I didn't use this term. We should get back in the habit of using it, but this is oxygen tension. Or it could be an increase in hypoxia. So that would maybe the way you'd be more familiar with this. Let me see, how's the time? Okay, we have 10 minutes. So this one, as soon as you reach 4, people kind of crashed, because this is all of them, right? That would act in the cardiovascular system and say which type of receptor. Well, hopefully you would know that ACH would act, and it would be on muscarinic receptors, and that is largely in the autorhythmic. And then norepinephrine would be an answer, and that would act on the beta 1 receptors. And then you could put norepinephrine, and it acts on the alpha 1 receptors, or it could act on the alpha 2, beta 2 receptors, if we're talking about the coronary vessels or the lungs. And you could have acetylcholine on nicotinic receptors in the ganglia. That would be valid. What other neurotransmitter was thinking about? What are you eating, dog? What are you eating? Oh, walnut shells, which is probably not good. Don't eat it. Okay. Anyway, sorry about that. Does this help with this one? Is there any questions about that one? Okay, so 17, wide open field. There's so many similarities between exercise and low blood volume dehydration. I've changed this to low blood volume so you don't have to worry about viscosity. But you could, this is SA3, or the last part of SA3. So yeah. If you want to work on any of these and send them to me, I could give you some feedback, but be careful if it's exactly like an essay, like the whole thing or something, then I'm probably going to be reluctant to give you a lot of feedback. But I'm always happy to answer questions. So, yeah. So this one is so close to the second part of essay 3. I'd suggest you ask questions like, would these be, here's a list, and then you need your explanation. Now this is 5 points, so I'm really saying it's describe, not list. So you have to have enough information. So you can't just say blood volume, you know, because one of them blood volume is affected and the other one blood volume is not, or renin or something like that. You have to give a little bit of an explanation. So make sure you do a little bit at least. Okay, this is that figure where it's asking what happens to hemoglobin. So the globins become amino acids. A bilirubin is made from the heme group. And then bilirubin has a couple fates. It can be secreted in urine and become urochrome. It can be formed into bile to be used for fat absorption and digestion. And it can be, eventually, some of that bile becomes the stercobilin of your feces. And then iron has lots of fates because some of it is bound up to transferrin and sent to the bone marrow, and some of it goes to the liver and is bound up by hemosiderin and ferritin. Okay, the last couple here. This is essay 4, which asks about short term. So short term, what I mean by that is your carotid aortic body and vasoconstriction you could include by renin, but for 5 points, if you just did the carotid aortic negative feedback loop, that would be plenty. And then long-term has to do with increasing blood volume. So there you need the renin, and you need it to affect ADH and aldosterone in order to get blood volume back up, because I specifically bring up blood volume. Okay, so this is right out of the book. Just tell me a proerythroblast is generates ribosomes, and that those ribosomes then begin to synthesize hemoglobin, and then the hemoglobin there's enough hemoglobin that starts to eject its organelles and becomes a reticulocyte. You don't have to name all the various subcategories of proerythroblast. So you can see this essay has evolved. I don't ask you. Plasma and its components are now entirely on the lab test, except indirectly on this one, because of course you need to know the albumin and you need to know the prothrombin and angiotensinogen, and all are made by the liver, because we did cover that in the lecture. And they're kind of, well, especially the albumin gets part of essay 5, where you talk about osmotic pressure. Then this looks like essay 5 here. The rest of it kind of looks like essay 5. Okay, I flew through that, and we only have 5 minutes left. Are there questions? Oh, there was a question that I never got to, the myogenic. Okay, so let's say you are a arterial wall, and this is your thin and thick filaments, and you're like this. Normally, you're not being stimulated by anybody. There's no norepinephrine, there's no epinephrine. Your thin is this much overlap with your thick. Remember, they're in a net. They're not in sarcomeres, but they're that much overlap. And suddenly, a bolus of blood, we don't have to worry about any norepinephrine, epinephrine, or any extrinsic factor. A bolus of blood starts to stretch me because it's trying to stretch the vessel. I am going to, as a muscle fiber without any kind of signal, I'm going to go back. So that will happen during systole, but it will happen a lot stronger and go back a lot more compensatory, because the capillaries are able to take normal amount of this, but the myogenic is going to try and lower it and draw out that pressure changes in the delicate capillaries. Now, where you really see it is if you see a big bolus of blood come in and you've really stretched it, it's going to strongly bring it back so that you protect those capillaries against bursting open. Similarly, if I'm like this and the blood pressure drops, so that's not during diastole, because diastole has to do with just how the wall normally sits. So this is what I would look like in diastole. But if there's sudden drop in blood pressure, like you have a low blood volume, and you see there's less stretch than usual, there'd be more overlap, then the myogenic will try and dilate this vessel so that more blood would go into it. So it's not like myogenic during diastole goes like this, and therefore the diastolic pressure is when there is no blood flowing. What is the position of the walls? It's a good question, and I know you're struggling with it because I feel like the book kind of just plops it in there without really explaining it. And in general, the book does a poor job of talking about smooth muscle. And so you may want to research that on your own. Okay, was there anything else that was a question? Okay, all right, so not to run over and let you guys run off and have some lunch, and me too. If you want more, I don't know that we'll do the exam, but if you want to look it over and you want to come back during the second lab section, you're more than welcome to do that. So I'm going to stop sharing here. And otherwise, remember that I will be available opening up Confer Zoom about 10 minutes before the exam starts, so about 9:10. So bring up whatever issue you have with the technical issue or whatever issue you have there. And so we communicate as best we can during the exam. And then if you feel like you want to ask questions in the exam, have your Confer Zoom open as well as your Canvas quiz open. Okay, new message. It just said maybe there is something new down there. Okay, great. Can I go over 20 again real quick? Well, can you come back? Because it's 20 is one of the short answers. So it looks like you have a couple reasons to come back. And if you can't in the next lab section because of your schedule, then you're welcome to email me and we can go back and forth through email. When do we submit the essay? It will be by 5 p.m. the same day as the Canvas test. What time is the next lab? The next lab starts at 1. All right, I am going to let you guys go and see you if you wish at 1 o'clock. Otherwise, happy studying for the weekend. And you can email me all weekend. I'm here. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
You're welcome.